In today's video, you'll learn what in the Wonderland is a poem, what it looks like, and how you can spot it in the wild. Hope you enjoy. My name is Igor Noblot. I'm a Venezuelan-American writer. If you're just tuning in, make sure to check out the first two videos in this 30-day poetry course linked in the description below. In today's video, we're gonna dissect poetry like a frog in a science class, and hopefully it'll make us feel all gooey inside the same way. Let's start with a quote from the Islamic poet Rumi that goes something like this: "Silence is the language of God. All else is poor translation." And if you're a lover like me of going on long hikes in the mountains, you understand the feeling that Rumi is trying to share here. Sometimes silence, or the absence of things, is the most filling of experiences. This is what poetry does for us and how it is different from other forms of writing. Writer Martha Brasco says that poetry is the only form of writing that touches primarily on the emotional spectrum of human experience, rather than communicating via mental constructs. In the absence of the concrete, the poem touches us deeply, spiritually, and meaningfully. Now, perhaps you were somewhat like me during high school and thought that a poem was just simply a bunch of words that rhymed. And you were partially right. Rhyme is a tool poetry uses, but it is not the only tool. The reality is that poetry, like fiction and nonfiction, are ways to communicate. The difference between an essay or a story and a poem is that the poem eliminates all explanations and speaks directly to our emotions through symbols and context. Author Jane Hirschfield has said in an interview for Psychology Today that poetry allows us to feel more acutely and accurately and more tenderly what is already present, and then it expands us. This is the goal of the poem, to help us feel something, and by doing so, we hope to better understand ourselves and the world and be rejuvenated. In essence, poems are for communicating emotions, feelings, and ideas within us. For example, love for another person, disappointment towards something or someone, sorrow, horror, or guilt, happiness or excitement for something, a moral, a lesson, or a teaching. And if you remember from our first video, I mentioned that trauma or stress can temporarily shut down the part of our brains that help us to put into words what we are feeling. Since this can be difficult for a lot of us, even without trauma, poems use other ways to express those things which are so hard to explain. They use metaphors and similes, which are comparisons to just that, the effect or quality of a thing by relation. They use denotation and connotation, which are concrete definitions of words and implied definitions of words to help us clarify ideas. They use many other techniques like alliteration and rhyme, assonance and puns, all of which I will forego explaining here for the sake of time, but to simplify and to make easily digestible difficult information. They use space and pauses and something called enjambment, where sentences are cut off in one line and continue in the next to help us group relevant information and images and direct us, if necessary, to something other than the direct thing in front of us. And they use meter, the stressed and unstressed parts of words, to manipulate the pacing of information and images and allow the audience to move more easily and remember what's being said. All of these manipulations can incite emotions as the reader is thrown about, confused with enjambment and meter, surprised by puns, delighted by rhymes, and spooked by assonance, and intrigued by metaphors and similes. We feel so much when we read poetry precisely because poetry is designed to make us feel something rather than understand something through an explanation. Now, it's also been said that defining poetry can be difficult, and if you noticed, I haven't actually given a definition for poetry or poems. I've only told you what it does and how it looks. Part of the issue with defining poetry comes from the fact that we use all of these poetic devices in our daily language so often that, were we to give a general description of poetry, all of our utterances would be poems. And if everything is a poem, then nothing is. The other issue comes when we try to give a specific definition of poetry. Too specific a definition can lead to exclusivity. Many poems would be denied the title because of minor absences. And who would give that definition anyway? Who has that much authority to define an entire form of expression? Well, us. The real answer is that we, as a public, as social and personal users of poetry, define things by how and when and why we use them. Some experts or group of experts are always coming along to say what is and isn't when it comes to language, but history teaches us that even the most authoritative entities fade into irrelevance because the masses, though they do not invent knowledge, are the ones who apply it. This being said, perhaps the best way to define a poem is by using its primary tool, the metaphor, to explain some truth about it. So here's a list of quotes about poetry that might help you understand what it is and what it isn't. Poetry is like a bird. It ignores all frontiers. Poetry is life distilled. Poetry is truth in its Sunday clothes. Poetry is a mirror which makes beautiful that which is distorted. Poetry is the lens we use to interrogate the history we land on and the future we stand for. Poetry is what gets lost in translation. Poetry is an echo asking a shadow to dance. Poetry is painting that speaks. Poetry is a place where both grief and grace can live. Prose, words in their best order. Poetry, the best words in the best order. It may be said that poems are in one way like icebergs. Only about a third of their bulk appears on the surface of the page. Poetry is not a matter of feeling, it is a matter of language. It is language which creates feeling. Poetry is the mother tongue of the human race. So poetry is a lot of things to a lot of people. Look, sometimes we are too accustomed here in the West to define things. Definitions give us a sense of closure, but not all things can be easily defined, nor do they need to be. Ultimately, while there are practical markers for poetry such as it plays with words or it uses some kind of literary device like metaphors or rhymes, or even it hints more than explains, we can't define poetry because that would be like defining language as a whole. You might get far with a few tools, but the path will inevitably be too shrouded to travel. Here's where our initial quote comes in. Where some saw abstraction, others saw the truth. We pass these beautiful opportunities for reflection, introspection, and self-expression, like we pass flowers on the road on our way to wherever. Poetry is everywhere, and to find it, we only need to slow down and look. Folks, if you've enjoyed this video and any of the previous ones in this series, please consider hitting that like button as it helps me to spread this information to others who might find it useful. And if you're interested in reading, writing, and enjoying poetry in your life, whether you're a student, a stay-at-home mom, or a teacher, or just a pedestrian cruising by this channel, click that subscribe button so you can keep up to date on all the videos and future poetry, literature, and life content. As always, thank you for watching, and remember, words, like food, nourish. See you next time.